Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we infect your brain with weird and wonderful science. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, Professor Robert Booy talks about infectious diseases, vaccines, epidemics, and pandemics. Professor Robert Booy is an honorary professor of paediatrics, an expert in vaccinology, epidemiology, and infectious diseases. Robert's been a professor since the last century, 1999. I spoke with him by Zoom and began by asking, what is a pandemic?
A pandemic comes from pan meaning across the world, demic meaning people. So when we talk about demography, that's the science of people, the number, the sex, the ages. And we talk about epidemiology, that's the science of public health. So pandemics are things that occur across the world. They're of a severe nature. They're a disease that affects a wide population, rich and poor countries, northern and southern hemispheres, eastern and western. They're across the world. Now, we've been having pandemics recognised for millennia, and in the last century, we've had a bunch. I've been personally involved in the 2009 influenza pandemic, which was influenza A H1, and otherwise known as swine flu. And that originated unusually in Mexico and the United States. However, having said that, the First World War was punctuated at its end by the Great Influenza. And the Great Influenza was also an influenza A H1 pandemic that spread across the world. And there's debate as to whether it started in France at the front or whether it started in Kansas at a military camp in the United States. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is that the 1919 Great Pandemic, it was 1919 before it affected Australia, it was 1918 when it started, and that's a distinction to draw. But that same pandemic was caused by the same virus that caused 2009, fully almost a century later. And there were people who were born and living in the early 1920s who were exposed to that pandemic and developed immunity, antibodies. And we were able to measure in research that those same people who were now in their late 80s had antibodies to the original pandemic, which cross-reacted with the new pandemic.
So the 1918 flu came back in a way.
It did. You could say that it hid in the animal population, in pigs, in poultry, and it affected particular farms. And it may have been that the virus evolved and changed and mutated into a less severe form, so it was less apparent in humans. But then it came back again, probably in the 1950s and again in the 1970s, but with a bang in 2009. Now, the fantastic research that was done in many countries, including by my team in Australia, looked at people who had antibody samples, blood samples collected from nursing homes before the pandemic. And we were able to measure that the highest rate of antibody was in people in their 80s and 90s. And there were lower rates in people in their 60s and 70s. So we presume this explains why the curious observation in 2009 that elderly people weren't badly affected was because they had cross-immunity from almost a century earlier. Now, that's important when we consider the COVID pandemic we've just been experiencing for 3 years. Australia's had nearly 20,000 deaths, and at least a half of those have been in old people in nursing homes. So COVID has been completely different to flu in terms of the influenza A H1 pandemic of 2009, which didn't affect old people nearly as much as it should have, whereas COVID has especially affected older people. And that's due to a coronavirus, a completely different virus. It is an RNA virus like flu, but completely different to the flu virus.
So amongst the many differences between them, I understand the evolution, the genetic changes that happen in flu are quite different to the ones that happen in the coronavirus.
Yeah, if we get down to the genetics, the coronavirus, although it and flu are both RNA viruses, the coronavirus has an enzyme called RNA polymerase, which means it's better able to correct the genetics, the code of its progeny. So one virus, when making new viruses, tends to make, amongst COVID, more accurate copies than does flu. So flu is more likely to mutate in your body over the course of a week. But COVID, as we've well learned, is still very able to mutate and change, just at a slower rate than flu. But COVID went through the original Wuhan strain, the ancestral strain, and then it went through alpha, beta, gamma, delta. And now we've got Omicron, A, B, C, D, E, and F, BA1 through BA5. So we've seen a lot of mutation. Let me say something really interesting, however. In the last 12 plus months, Omicron has been the predominant variant of concern for COVID. And so we think the RNA virus has run out of tricks. It's run out of ways to mutate and escape our immune mechanisms, our immune responses, our antibodies and our T cells. So we may well be at the end of the current COVID pandemic or close to it, because we've got antibody from vaccination, from infection, and the combination called hybrid immunity is very strong. And so right now in Australia, the incidence of COVID and the complications of death have fallen remarkably just in the last couple of months.
Although I was hearing that the immunity you get from vaccination or from having had a COVID infection doesn't last very long compared to some illnesses.
Every single pandemic teaches us something new. And isn't it amazing that the 1918-19 pandemic of flu produced antibody that still worked in 2009, whereas COVID antibodies, due to either vaccine or disease, may only last months, and the protection can decline, so that we're currently recommending people, if they're at risk, to have a booster every 6 months. So if you haven't had a booster or a wild case of disease in the last 6 months, you're currently, if you're an at-risk person, recommended to have a booster. So what a complete difference between month-long immunity to COVID and decade-long immunity to influenza AH1 between 1918 and 2009.
It is remarkable, although, we still pretty much have to get a new flu vaccination once a year to be protected.
We are. And if you look at the impact of flu versus COVID at the moment, we saw over 12,000 deaths in Australia in 2022 from COVID, and we saw less than 1,000 deaths from flu. So in terms of severity, COVID is much more severe at the present time than flu. And yes, you're right, as I've intimated already, influenza A is an RNA virus that mutates readily, does not have a polymerase enzyme to correct its mistakes. So we're constantly trying to chase the mutations and the changes that the virus has made. I've sat on the committee that Australia has for the Australian Influenza Vaccine Committee for over 10 years. And each year we change the vaccine in line with what's most likely to cause disease and death in Australian citizens, so that when they get their vaccine in March, April, May each year, they'll get a vaccine that's likely to be protective.
It's such a big thing. I know in my own case, I used to get bad flu every year of my life until the flu vaccine became widely available in Australia. And I would be sick for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yes, flu is different to the average common cold, but there's what I call a double truth. Interestingly, way back in 1919, at the Great Influenza and any influenza outbreak, the majority of cases are more like the common cold, and they're a sniffle and a fever and a few days discomfort. A minority of cases are like the classical flu, where you get fatigue, high fever, muscle ache, cough that lasts for at least a week, lethargy. This kind of flu is the minority, but it's more common with influenza than it is with common cold viruses like the rhinovirus or respiratory syncytial virus. So it's interesting. There's a double truth. The majority of flu is actually quite mild, but the minority, which cannot be predicted unless we know that you're vaccinated, and then you're less likely to get severe flu. The minority who genetically, we're still not sure why they get it, but there is some clues, get severe flu, and as you described, can have symptoms for weeks, like they can with coronavirus.
Not only would I get sick with severe flu for weeks and weeks and weeks, but then just as I was recovering from that, I would get sinus infection, rhinus infections, throat, chest, everything, because my immune system was weakened?
Well, that's a really good point. And I've done research on bacterial infections which occur in a secondary afterward nature after flu. And the classic one is meningococcal disease, a disease which causes rash and fever and meningitis, blood poisoning, septic arthritis, even pneumonia. So meningococcal disease, a bacterial infection for which we have effective vaccines, by the way, as well, that can occur something like 5 to 15 days after the flu. And there's a classic epidemiological observation that little outbreaks of flu lead to little or bigger outbreaks of meningococcal disease. And we've published this in the Medical Journal of Australia in 2022. And it was first observed with the great influenza in 1918, 1919. There's a paper published in the BMJ in about 1918 showing that prior influenza infection predisposes to meningococcal disease, especially in young army recruits who are sleeping in crowded conditions, cheek by jowl, close together.
These post-viral infections after flu, for example, or possibly after COVID, does this hit any sort of age group or person more than others?
Yes, that's an important question. Back in 1918, influenza affected very young children and also affected, in another peak, people in their 20s. And then in a third peak, the elderly. So there were 3 peaks. We called it a W curve of peaks in the very young 20-something-year-olds and elderly people. So that's one thing. But meningococcal disease especially affects most commonly babies under 1, but to a lesser extent affects older teenagers and people in their 20s. And to a lesser extent, but still importantly, older people can get meningococcal too, as well as flu. What we see currently by way of influenza in the community is that there's a peak in babies and children under 5, and another peak in older people or people with major medical problems causing immunosuppression, lung, heart disease, etc. So it's really important to know your health, your age, and your liability to infection. Corona affected most severely the elderly and people with major medical problems, but was very mild, generally speaking, in babies and young children. So children had some innate immunity, some inbuilt immunity that worked very well to prevent severe COVID in the great majority of children. So the distinctions, again, are fascinating.
And there's some diseases, particularly some of the ones of childhood, that you can recover from the disease, but the virus lives on in you and can cause lots of problems later in life.
Yes, that's perfectly true. That's especially the case with herpes viruses. EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, can live on in your B lymphocytes and come back later in a number of ways, including cancer. CMV, cytomegalovirus, can do the same. It can hide and come back in various forms. The classical one is herpes zoster, otherwise known as varicella chickenpox. And it infects most people by the age of 15, but then the virus hides in your spinal cord or at the back of your brain, a place called the dorsal root ganglia, sensory cells where the virus has found its way and just sits there dormantly, quietly, for decades. And then under stress, under immunosuppression, especially when the T cells, the cellular immunity is diminished, then under that kind of stress, it might be caused by immunosuppression or by cancer, you get what's called zoster or shingles. And it tends to be just on one part of your body, your chest or your abdomen, but sometimes your face. And that can be really quite severe. It can cause a localized blistering rash and pain. And the pain in 1/3 of cases can last more than 3 months. So it's something that's really worth preventing. However, again, a curious difference. Zoster is not an epidemic or pandemic disease because it can hide in your spinal cord for a century before it comes out again. It's a function of your own personal individual immunity, and it comes out when you're immunosuppressed for some reason and by way of your T cells. Both my sister and my mother had it severely. My sister had it because she had multiple myeloma, a bone cancer. My mother had it because she just got old and had repeated episodes in her 80s. So this is a disease that is nasty. It's preventable too by a vaccine. Talk to your GP about that. But it's not an epidemic disease. It occurs individually.
You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com.
There's a new vaccine for shingles, I understand, but unfortunately it's not widely available off the PBS, so it's a bit expensive.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is recommended over the previous vaccine, which is live. And because the previous vaccine was live, it can't be given to those most at risk who are immunosuppressed. So the new vaccine, unfortunately, has to be paid for. I've had it myself. It's a 2-dose course. It's very effective. It does give you a bloody sore arm for a day or two in most cases, but that gets better after 3 days. And this new vaccine is actually more effective and more longer lasting in its protection. So it's especially important for people at the greatest risk, whether they're immunosenescent from being old or immunodeficient from having cancer or chemotherapy or something similar, high-dose steroids. So there is a vaccine. It's something you have to talk to your GP about, and they can advise you on how you can protect yourself.
Do we have any protection for Epstein-Barr virus?
For many decades, people have been trying to develop a vaccine and better treatments. We don't have a vaccine yet for Epstein-Barr virus. It affects us in many ways. It actually, in Africa, affects babies, and most babies and young children get infected before they go to school. And if it's combined with some immunosuppression due to, say, malaria, you can get a cancer, a lump on the side of your neck called Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that can lead to a deadly disease which kills in childhood. And it's originally due to Epstein-Barr virus. We know that teenagers get it through kissing. Intimate contact, mouth to mouth, tongue to tongue, can transmit this virus in teenagers, and they can get a disease with lymph node enlargement, high fever, perhaps even the spleen can be enlarged, and they get fatigue, and it can go on for weeks, and in some people for months and years. So that can lead to what we call a chronic fatigue syndrome in some people who have EBV. And then in older people, there's some cancers like hairy cell leukemia and other lymphomas, which can be induced by decades-long infection with EBV.
There's a lot of things going on there. And of course, in recent times, we've had SARS and MERS and all sorts of things.
Yes, it's been really curious the way coronavirus has come to the fore only in the last 15 or so years. We first learned about SARS 20 years ago, and it was a problem in East Asia. It came out of a wet market in China, the transfer from a bat to a mammal of the virus, and then from a mammal in the wet market to humans. We then saw 10 years later MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, again caused by a coronavirus, but it surged from bats into camels. And it's actually thought that it might have been in camels for some decades. And then close contact between camel herders and other people who deal with camels led to them getting infected. And we got MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. I've been doing research for 20 years at the annual Muslim pilgrimage called the Hajj, Hajj. And we thought MERS could easily be a problem there, being a Middle East problem and being the Hajj occurring at Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia on an annual basis. But curiously, they were able to keep the camel contact very low and to prevent outbreaks at the Hajj. I actually did research over 20 years ago on meningococcal disease as a complication of flu. And we showed way back in 2002 that there were hundreds of people affected with meningococcal disease who probably had previous flu, but they developed a serious disease. But not only did the adults get disease, they brought it back carrying it in their throat. What happened was when the pilgrims came back as adults to East London, where I was working at the Royal London Hospital at the time, they passed the bacteria on to their children and to children in the community through the local mosque, through families, through even ultimately through some churches as well. And what we were able to find was that the incidence of meningococcal disease, which prefers babies and young children, was actually more common in East London in the babies and children than it wasn't in the adults. So the adults were just carrying the germ, but through personal and household and other contact, they spread it to babies and children. And they developed not only carriage of the germ in their throat, but invasion into their bloodstream and blood poisoning and meningitis. And we had 2 deadly cases 2 days in a row at our emergency department way back in 2001, 2002. So there you go. There you see again the interaction between viruses and bacteria, and that either or both can cause real trouble to human populations.
And it's interesting, that's one of those things of history that we got antibiotics midway through last century and it made a huge difference to public health. And more recently we've started getting effective antivirals, although they seem to be more specific to the families of viruses.
Yes, some antivirals are very specific to particular herpes viruses, for example. You can take acyclovir or valcyclovir to prevent herpes zoster and other herpes infections. Antibiotics, when they were first invented, were pretty effective against a lot of different bacteria. And an Australian was crucial to the invention. He got the Nobel Prize. His name was Howard Florey, 1945, did fantastic work developing penicillin. But way back in 1945, even then, the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize, whose name was Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist, he predicted, and it became evident very quickly, that bacterial resistance to antibiotics would become a problem. So penicillin is still an effective antibiotic, but only for much narrower range of bacteria. So we use it for example, Group A and Group B strep and some pneumococcal disease, but a lot of bacteria are resistant to penicillin, and that's why we've had to develop over the decades many new forms of antibiotics for bacteria. Antivirals resistance can occur as well, and for flu we've got a number of drugs for which resistance can develop to particular antivirals, and we have the same for other serious viral infections that humans get.
So I guess that's another problem we have to look out for, is the viruses evolving past our antiviral drugs.
Yes, that's why with public health measures and epidemiology, we take multiple measures between us. We have non-pharmaceutical approaches with hand washing, mask use, physical separation, etc. We have isolation and quarantine. And quarantine, in fact, is a wonderful story. It comes from the Italian meaning 40 days, Quaranta, and it was first practiced in the 14th century with the Black Plague of Europe. But we also have, as you've asked, specific antiviral measures, and we also have vaccines, which are preventative. We also have monoclonal antibodies, which can act in both a preventive or a therapeutic way. So we have a multiple armamentarium for controlling viruses and bacteria, and viruses in particular. We've learnt so much just in the last 3 years. There's been an extraordinary cornucopia of discoveries and understandings which have improved our management of the latest pandemic due to COVID-19.
I thought it was curious that we have 2 anti-flu drugs, Tamiflu and Relenza, and we almost never prescribe them in Australia.
It's a nice bit of history to that, in that the anti-flu, antiviral drugs had real contributions from Australian scientists, particularly Relenza. We now have a new antiviral flu drug which only takes a single dose to use. It's called baloxavir. Now, when we talk about Relenza and oseltamivir, they are neuraminidase inhibitors. They inhibit the enzyme on the outside of the flu virus, which helps it to escape from our human cells and infect other cells. Baloxavir works somewhat similarly, but through a different mechanism, and it only requires 1 dose, so it's much more likely to be effective. The problem with the antiviral drugs is that they only work if you give them within 2 or maximum 3 days of developing symptoms. The virus doesn't get controlled by antivirals if you give them too late. So whether or not it's baloxavir or oseltamivir, you have to give it on time. And we've done research for many years, or over a decade, in nursing homes, trying to diagnose flu early in people who are at high risk, who are elderly, immunosenescent, their immune system works poorly. Get them diagnosed early, get them treated early, and thereby not only can you save the individual's life, but furthermore, you can help to reduce transmission to other residents in the nursing home and save other people's lives into the bargain.
Do we have a rapid test for flu?
We have several rapid tests for flu and RSV and COVID, and now we've got rapid tests that can look for 2 or 3 at the same time. So that's exciting. We all know how to use a rapid test for COVID. I've used one myself many times and I've turned out positive twice. For flu, we have a rapid test as well. It looks for the antigen being the protein on the outside of the virus. It's moderately sensitive. It's maybe between 60 and 90% finds the virus when it's there. It's not perfect. It's not as good as a PCR, a polymerase chain reaction, which is a genetic test, which is more accurate and more sensitive and more able to find when you've got infection. But rapid antigen tests are available through chemists. They're effective, they're relatively cheap, and they're worth using. Pandemics are completely fascinating. They're a function of environmental, infectious disease, and human interaction. As we have mushroomed in numbers to the point where there are now 8 million people in the world, we encroach more and more on animal reservoirs and the viruses they carry. But bats and monkeys and other mammals are able to transmit virus through what we call spillover, through proximity of humans and animals. We can do something about that. We need to do much better surveillance to discover at an early stage an epidemic before it becomes a pandemic. We've learned so much in the last few years. We've got a lot more to learn. Much better surveillance to do, better vaccines to develop, and antivirals to implement. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your time.
Good to talk. Lovely to spend time with you. Thank you.
That was Professor Robert Booy talking about infectious diseases. You can hear Robert speaking at the Frontiers of Science Forum at Concord Golf Club in Sydney on Friday, 24th of March. More Frontiers of Science Forum speakers next week.
And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Are you a scientist, artist, biohacker or maker who'd like to be interviewed about your work? Would your company like to sponsor Diffusion? Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. Please subscribe to the Diffusion Science Radio channel on youtube.com/c/diffusionradio and rate the show on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 28 stations on the Community Radio Network, including Radio Blue Mountains 89.1 FM in New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2MVR in Nambucca Valley, 3MVR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia, City Park Radio 7LTN in Launceston, Tasmania, and 2XXFM in Canberra. Diffusion is narrowcast on Indigo FM 88 in northeast Victoria. Diffusion is syndicated globally on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com, and check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 1,000 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Make a donation through paypal.me/IanWolf or join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.